Selena Moore's name was whispered in corners most people never admitted to visiting. To some, she was nothing more than a scandalous figure, an escort whose beauty blurred the lines of gender, a woman who had remade herself in defiance of every rule society tried to place on her. But to those who knew her, or who at least tried to, she was far more complicated. Selena was not just a body for sale. She was a survivor, a performer, and a woman fighting every day to prove that she deserved the same respect as anyone else. Her life had never been easy. Born in a small southern town, she was once a boy named Samuel, a child who knew early that the reflection in the mirror didn't belong to him. The church her family attended every Sunday called people like her a sin. Her father, a truck driver hardened by decades of long miles and short tempers, warned her to act like a man or be thrown out. When the truth finally became too heavy to hide, Selena, barely 18, packed a single bag and left. Her parents never spoke to her again. The city became her refuge, though it was as cruel as it was liberating. She was young, broke, and alone. Jobs that promised security were never given to women like her. Doors slammed the moment an ID or a medical history revealed more than she wanted anyone to know. So she carved her own path in the underground world of sex work. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also hers. Within a few short years, she became one of the most sought-after escorts in her circle, a figure of both fascination and envy. Clients paid not only for her time, but for the aura she carried, confident, untouchable, mysterious. Yet when the lipstick was wiped away and the clothes came off, Selena's world shrank back to the size of a modest downtown apartment. Inside those four walls, away from neon lights and men with hungry eyes, she allowed herself moments of vulnerability. She loved cooking late at night, playing soft jazz on an old stereo while she stirred a pot of gumbo the way her grandmother once taught her. She collected scented candles, lining them along her windowsill, lighting them in different colors depending on her mood. She kept a journal under her bed, filled with confessions no one would ever read. Despite the chaos of her job, Selena held on to rules that kept her sane, rules that made her feel human. The most important one was simple. Her body was hers, and she had the right to say no. No amount of money, no name on the client list, no promises whispered in the dark would ever change that. Some men accepted those boundaries, others tested them, and a few grew hostile when they realized they couldn't buy control. Selena had learned how to read danger in a man's eyes. When she sensed it, she turned them away, no matter the cost. Still, danger had a way of finding her. She knew every time she opened her door to a stranger, she was taking a risk. But she believed in the walls of her apartment. She believed that with her instincts, with her voice, she could keep herself safe. Her friends sometimes warned her otherwise. "One day, it's not going to be so easy to say no, Selena," a fellow worker told her once. Selena only smiled, replying with a stubbornness that had carried her through the worst. "If that day ever comes, it'll be on my terms. Always my terms." What Selena never realized was that the line between control and chaos could be shattered in an instant, not by the world outside, not by a faceless threat in the dark alley, but by a man who would walk right through her door. He would look like so many others, ordinary, unremarkable, yet inside him brewed something dangerous. He wasn't searching for intimacy or comfort. He wasn't looking for connection. He wanted power. And when Selena refused him, when she dared to hold on to her rule, his fragile pride would transform into violence. For now, though, the candles burned gently in her apartment. The faint rhythm of music floated in the air. To the world, Selena Moore was a star of forbidden desire. But in this quiet space, she was simply a woman who had fought too hard to let anyone take away her right to choose. And that belief, as unshakable as it seemed, would soon cost her everything. Derek Johnson was the kind of man you could pass on the street without ever looking twice. He blended into the background, a tall, broad-shouldered construction worker with hands roughened by years of labor, a face worn down by sweat, and a voice that always carried a hint of menace, even when he tried to be polite. To his co-workers, he was simply Big D, a man who liked cheap beer, Friday night fights on TV, and talking too loudly about women. But behind that ordinary exterior lived a storm no one truly understood. Derek had grown up under a roof where violence wasn't just common, it was expected. His father disciplined with fists instead of words, and his mother learned early to stay silent or leave the house altogether. By the time Derek turned 18, he had already been arrested twice for bar fights. He learned that to survive in his world, you didn't back down. You didn't look weak. And you sure as hell didn't let anyone question your manhood. That belief was more than pride. It was poison. It made Derek fragile in ways he couldn't admit. He couldn't stand rejection, couldn't tolerate the idea of someone telling him he wasn't enough. He needed women not for love, but for validation. Every conquest, every notch in his belt, was proof he wasn't the scared boy his father used to beat. It was through a friend at a local bar that Derek first heard about Selena Moore. His friend described her like a challenge, like some forbidden prize only the bold could claim. "She's not like the others, man," the friend said, lowering his voice. "She's different, a real star. But she doesn't just take anyone. You gotta make her say yes." The words struck Derek harder than he expected. Make her say yes. That sounded less like a warning and more like an invitation. He didn't care that Selena was transgender, at least, not in the way others might have. To him, that detail became a twisted excuse. If she was different, if she wasn't a real woman in his mind, then denying her choices, crossing her boundaries, somehow felt less wrong. At least, that's what he told himself. But beneath those excuses was something far simpler and darker. Derek wanted control. He wanted to be the one to take down the woman everyone else talked about but couldn't have. To him, Selena wasn't a person. She was a conquest waiting to happen, a chance to prove to himself, and maybe to the world, that no one could turn him away. Still, Derek didn't rush in blindly. For weeks he stalked the edges of her world. He asked around, found out where she lived, even lingered in the shadows outside the building once or twice just to watch the lights in her apartment window. The sight of her silhouette moving against the blinds made him restless, almost feverish. He convinced himself that the anticipation was unbearable, that he deserved her attention simply because he wanted it so badly. When Derek finally decided to make his move, it wasn't out of romance or desire. It was calculation. He ironed his shirt for the first time in months, splashed on cologne that smelled stronger than he realized, and walked up the stairs of Selena's apartment with a confidence that came more from arrogance than charm. He rehearsed lines in his head, things he'd say to soften her, to flatter her, to make her believe he was different from the rest. But even as he knocked on her door, a part of him already seethed. If she turned him away, if she dared to laugh or reject him, he knew the fury inside would erupt. His pride couldn't handle the thought of walking back down those steps a failure. He had spent his whole life trying to outrun weakness, and he believed that one woman's no could undo it all. The truth was, Derek didn't come to Selena's apartment looking for intimacy. He came looking for dominance. He came with an expectation that her body, her voice, her choice didn't matter, and in the quiet seconds before the door opened, he already felt a dangerous certainty building in his chest. If she resisted, if she denied him, he would take what he believed was his. When Selena's door finally creaked open and her eyes met his, she couldn't yet know the storm that had just crossed her threshold. For Derek Johnson, this wasn't simply a night of pleasure. It was the beginning of a tragedy that would end in blood. The knock on Selena's door came just after midnight. The city outside was restless but muted. Horns in the distance, a motorcycle growling somewhere down the block, footsteps echoing in the hallway. Selena had just lit a lavender candle on her windowsill, the kind she always burned to calm her nerves. When she opened the door, Derek stood there, taller than she expected, his frame filling the narrow entrance. His shirt was pressed, his hair slicked back, and his smile tried too hard to look inviting. "Selena Moore," he said, voice low, heavy with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment in the mirror. "I've heard a lot about you." Selena tilted her head, her intuition immediately sharp. She had seen that look before, the gleam in a man's eyes that spoke less of curiosity and more of possession. Still, she stepped aside, keeping her voice even. "Come in. But let's get one thing clear. I don't do anything I don't want to do. Understand?" Derek smirked as he walked past her. "We'll see about that." Inside, the apartment glowed softly with candlelight. A Coltrane record played faintly in the background. Selena moved with grace, her presence commanding, but her mind was cautious. She'd learned to read danger in seconds, and something in Derek's swagger unsettled her. They sat across from each other, Selena in her velvet chair, Derek on the edge of the couch. For a moment, the air seemed almost civil. He asked about her life, though his eyes never left her body. She answered politely but guarded, keeping her distance. "You've got a reputation," Derek said finally, leaning forward. "They say you turn men away if you don't feel like it. That true?" Selena met his stare without flinching. "It's not a reputation. It's a boundary. My body, my rules." That answer should have been enough, but Derek's jaw tightened. He masked it with a chuckle, though his pride had already taken the first blow. "Come on," he said, his tone shifting. "You don't mean that with me. Look at me. You know I'm not like those other guys." Selena shook her head, her voice firm. "I don't care who you are. No means no." The music played on, but tension swallowed the room. Derek leaned back, his smile gone now, replaced by a hard glare. He wasn't used to hearing rejection spoken so calmly, so unapologetically. In his world, men demanded and women obeyed. Selena's refusal, her confidence, ignited something ugly inside him. He rose suddenly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just slam the door in my face and walk away?" Selena stayed seated, though her heart raced. She had been in dangerous situations before, clients who pushed too hard, men who thought money bought them control, but this felt different. This man wasn't after intimacy. He was after power. "Derek," she said, steady but sharp, "you need to leave. Right now. I won't say it again." Her words were like gasoline to a fire. He stopped pacing and turned toward her, his face twisted with rage. "Leave," he spat. "After I came all the way here? After I wasted my time on you?" He stepped closer, towering over her. "You don't get to tell me no. Not you." Selena stood then, refusing to cower. She lifted her chin, her voice like steel. "Yes, I do. Every woman does. And you're going to walk out that door, or you're going to regret it." For a brief second, silence hung heavy between them. Derek's chest heaved, his fists clenched. He could have turned and left. He could have walked away with nothing more than wounded pride. But pride was the one thing Derek never let go of. In his mind, Selena's defiance wasn't just rejection, it was humiliation. And humiliation demanded an answer. He lunged. Selena cried out, shoving him back with all her strength, but his arms were too strong. He grabbed her wrists, forcing her against the wall. She kicked, fought, clawed at him, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Stop!" she screamed. "You can't take this from me." But Derek's fury had swallowed reason. He hurled words at her, slurs, insults, venom meant to strip her dignity as his hands tightened with violence. Selena's resistance only fueled him more. Every second she fought reminded him of the control he didn't have. The struggle raged through the apartment, the clatter of a lamp knocked to the floor, the shatter of glass, the thud of bodies against furniture. Outside, the city remained oblivious, the sounds of the street drowning out the chaos inside. Selena fought harder than she had ever fought before, but Derek was relentless. In his twisted mind, this wasn't just about sex anymore. It was about dominance, about punishing the woman who dared to say no. And as the minutes dragged into what felt like hours, the walls of Selena's sanctuary became the walls of her prison. Her rules, her boundaries, her strength, none of it could stop the storm Derek had carried through her door. By the time his rage subsided enough for him to realize what he had done, the candlelight still flickered, the record still spun, but the life inside Selena's eyes was fading. The room seemed to shake with every crash. The lamp lay shattered in a pool of glass. The record player still spun, its needle skipping violently over Coltrane's saxophone, producing a hollow, distorted sound that filled the silence between screams. Selena's breaths came ragged, her chest heaving as she tried to claw her way free from Derek's grip. Her nails scraped across his face, leaving angry red marks. For a brief second he stumbled, and she darted toward the door. Her heart pounded with one desperate thought: if I can just get outside, someone will hear me. But Derek was faster. He lunged and caught her by the hair, yanking her backward so hard she cried out in pain. He slammed her against the wall, his voice a low growl. "You think you can embarrass me?" he hissed. "You think you get to tell me no? Not tonight." Selena's body shook, but her voice remained defiant. "I said no, Derek. You can't own me. You'll never own me." The words pierced him deeper than any blow could. To him, they weren't just a refusal. They were a declaration of her power over him. His pride couldn't bear it. His rage burned hotter, feeding off the humiliation he believed she had dealt him. He pressed his forearm across her throat, his weight forcing the air from her lungs. She kicked, struggling wildly, gasping for breath. Tears streamed down her face, not from weakness, but from the body's desperate fight to survive. "Please," she rasped, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. You don't have to." But mercy had no place in Derek's eyes. His teeth clenched, his muscles locked, and with each second he pressed harder, drowning out the sound of her pleas with the pounding of his own fury. Selena's vision blurred. Her body flailed, then weakened. Her hand grasped for the candle on the shelf beside her, knocking it down. Wax spilled across the floor as the flame sputtered out. The apartment grew darker, the flickering shadows now cruel witnesses to the violence unfolding. For Derek, time seemed to slow. He wasn't thinking about consequences, about life or death. He was consumed only by the need to silence the defiance that had cut so deep into his fragile pride. And then, stillness. Selena's body went slack in his arms, her head tilting to the side, eyes half open, lips parted as though caught mid-sentence. The sound of her breathing was gone. The fight that had filled the room moments earlier had vanished into a silence so heavy it nearly crushed him. Derek staggered back, releasing her. She crumpled to the floor, her body folding unnaturally against the shards of broken glass. The jazz record hissed in the background, a haunting soundtrack to the aftermath. For a moment, Derek simply stared. His chest heaved, sweat pouring down his face. His hands shook. He hadn't planned to kill her, at least not consciously. He had come here to take, to dominate, to prove his power. But now she lay still, and the weight of what he had done began to settle. "Selena," he muttered, his voice suddenly small. He crouched beside her, shaking her shoulder. "Come on. Get up. Don't play with me." But she didn't move. Her skin had already begun to pale under the dim light, her once bright eyes staring at nothing. The reality hit him with brutal force. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. Panic surged through him. He staggered to his feet, pacing the room in frantic circles. He cursed under his breath, running his hands through his hair. His boots crunched on broken glass as he moved, leaving chaotic footprints that would betray him later. He thought about running. He thought about calling someone. He even thought, for a fleeting second, about turning himself in. But shame quickly drowned those thoughts. He couldn't bear the idea of the world knowing he had been with a transgender woman, that he had lost control, that he had killed her. Instead, he stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on his face, scrubbing at the scratches on his skin where her nails had dug deep. The mirror reflected a man he didn't recognize, wild-eyed, blood on his cheek, sweat dripping from his temples. Back in the living room, Selena's body lay motionless, a silent accusation. Derek approached her again, kneeling down as if somehow she might wake. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch almost tender now, but it was far too late for tenderness. "You shouldn't have fought me," he whispered, as if the words could justify what he had done. "You should have just let me." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Selena had done nothing wrong. Her only crime was refusing to surrender, refusing to let a man's fragile ego dictate her worth. And for that, she had paid with her life. The air in the apartment grew heavy, thick with the smell of sweat, spilled wax, and something else, something final. Derek stood and grabbed his jacket, his mind racing. He didn't bother to clean up the mess. There was too much of it. Too many broken pieces, too many fingerprints, too much blood on his conscience. He yanked open the door and slipped into the hallway, his footsteps echoing as he disappeared into the night. Behind him, Selena's home, her sanctuary, had become her grave. The candles had burned low, the record still spinning on a broken note, as if the world itself refused to let the moment end. Outside, the city carried on as though nothing had happened. Cars honked. Laughter spilled from a nearby bar. Neon signs flickered over sidewalks littered with Saturday night revelers. No one knew that inside a modest apartment above them, a woman's voice had been silenced forever. Selena Moore had fought to live on her own terms. And in the end, it was that courage, that refusal to surrender, that provoked a man like Derek Johnson to destroy her. But what Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in that fevered rush of violence, was that the world would not stay silent. Neighbors would hear the echoes. The police would come. And the truth of what he had done in that dimly lit room would follow him like a shadow he could never escape. 2 days passed before anyone opened Selena Moore's door again. The building where she lived was the kind of place where neighbors kept to themselves. People came and went at all hours, and nobody asked questions. But by the second night, whispers began spreading in the hallway. Someone noticed her lights had been left on. Another neighbor, an older woman who always greeted Selena warmly, complained of a strange odor creeping through the vents. On the third morning, the calls started, first to the landlord, then to the police. When the officers arrived, the hallway was lined with tenants pretending not to look, though every eye followed as uniformed men pounded on Selena's door. There was no answer. After a tense moment, one officer rammed his shoulder into the wood until the lock gave way. The smell hit them first. Heavy, sour, unmistakable, the stench of death lingering in the air. Inside, the apartment was dim, curtains drawn, candles melted into puddles of wax. The jazz record still spun in lazy circles, its needle long since caught in an endless skip. And there she was. Selena lay on the floor near the wall, her body twisted among shards of broken glass, her face pale and still. To the officers, it was a scene they had witnessed too many times before, a life cut short in violence. But even hardened men felt something shift in their chests as they looked at her. There was an elegance that remained, even in death, a quiet dignity that told them this was no ordinary case. Detective Harold Green was called in almost immediately. He was in his 50s, a man who had seen more than enough brutality to dull his emotions. But when he stepped into Selena's apartment, something about the silence unsettled him. He noticed the candles, the record player, the way the room was arranged. This wasn't the chaos of someone who invited danger. This was a sanctuary, destroyed by someone who had no right to be here. "Get photos of everything," Green ordered, his voice low but sharp. He crouched beside Selena, studying the bruises around her neck, the scratches on her arms where she had fought back. She hadn't gone quietly, that much was clear. Word of her death spread quickly through the building, then the neighborhood, and soon the city. To some, she was simply another escort whose risky life had caught up with her. But to others, she was a symbol, of beauty, of defiance, of a marginalized world forced to live in shadows. Within hours, social media filled with both grief and cruelty, posts mourning her loss, and comments drenched in prejudice. Outside her apartment, a small group of friends and fellow workers gathered, lighting candles and leaving flowers by the front steps. They whispered her name through tears, recalling her laughter, her stubborn independence. One woman said softly, "She always told me she'd never let a man break her. I guess she was right. She didn't break. He just killed her." The contrast was stark. While those who knew her wept, others sneered. News stations framed the story with sensational headlines. Transgender sex worker found dead in apartment. The word sex worker overshadowed woman, and for many viewers, that was all they needed to dismiss her humanity. Detective Green felt the weight of that narrative as he began piecing together what happened. He wasn't blind to the way cases like Selena's were treated, with less urgency, less compassion. But for him, this wasn't just another file. He had seen the fight etched into her skin, the evidence of someone who refused to surrender. That demanded justice. As her body was carried out on a stretcher, covered in a white sheet, the hallway filled with silence. Neighbors lowered their eyes, ashamed, curious, afraid. For Selena's friends, the moment felt unreal. The woman who once laughed the loudest in their circle, who carried herself like she was untouchable, was now gone, reduced to a headline, a statistic. But Detective Green knew better. She wasn't just a body on a gurney. She was a voice that had been silenced for daring to say no. And as he closed the door behind him, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would find the man who did this. He would make sure Selena Moore's story didn't end in shadows. What neither he nor the community yet realized was how quickly the search for her killer would tear open deeper wounds, about prejudice, power, and the fragility of pride that had driven a man to commit murder in her own home. Detective Harold Green sat at his desk long after midnight, staring at the photographs spread across the table. Selena's apartment had told a story, a violent one. The broken lamp, the shards of glass, the wax from the fallen candle, the scratches on her arms and face. This wasn't a quiet death. She had fought tooth and nail against the man who had taken her life. Green leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. He'd worked homicide for nearly 20 years, but this case felt heavier than most. Maybe it was the way she had lived, defiant, unashamed. Maybe it was the way the world seemed eager to dismiss her, already writing her off as just another escort. He refused to let her be forgotten. The first breakthrough came from the building's security cameras. The grainy footage showed a tall man arriving just after midnight, his face half hidden under the shadow of a baseball cap. He knocked, entered, and didn't leave until nearly 3 in the morning. Green froze the frame, studying the shape of the man's shoulders, the heavy stride, the moment he adjusted his cap before disappearing down the stairwell. He had seen that posture before. The second piece of evidence came from Selena's phone. Among dozens of text messages from clients and friends, there was a string of messages from an unfamiliar number. The tone shifted quickly, from flattery to insistence, from charm to aggression. The last message, sent just hours before her death, read, "You won't tell me no. I'll make you change your mind." Green tapped his pen against the desk. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a customer. He was a threat who had planned to force his way in. Witness interviews confirmed what he already suspected. A neighbor in 4B, an elderly woman who lived across the hall, remembered hearing a man's voice raised in anger that night. Another tenant swore he heard something crash against the wall. No one had called the police then, just another argument in a city full of them, but the details lined up too neatly to ignore. By the end of the week, the investigation pointed squarely at Derek Johnson. His name came up through a friend of a friend who admitted introducing him to Selena. When detectives ran his record, it painted a grim picture: multiple arrests for assault, restraining orders from 2 ex-girlfriends, a reputation for quick tempers and broken promises. Green didn't hesitate. A warrant went out. But Derek had vanished. When officers arrived at his apartment, they found it abandoned. His clothes were gone, his phone shut off. He hadn't shown up for work in days. It was clear he knew the net was closing in. The manhunt began. Green and his team combed through the city, checking the places Derek was known to haunt: dive bars, pool halls, the corners where men like him gathered to drink and boast. Flyers went up, a press release hit the evening news, and Selena's name once again filled the headlines. This time, her face was plastered alongside his, the victim and the suspect bound together by violence. Community reaction was divided. Some mourned openly, holding vigils for Selena, demanding justice. Others scoffed, muttering that the police were wasting time on someone like her. Green ignored the noise. To him, a victim was a victim, and Selena deserved the same fight for justice as anyone else. 3 days into the search, the break came. A tip led officers to a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The manager recognized Derek's photo immediately. He had checked in under a fake name, paying cash. Room 12. Green rode with the tactical team, his stomach a knot of tension. When they stormed the room, Derek barely had time to react. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, boots unlaced, a bottle of whiskey at his feet. His eyes went wide, and for a brief second, fear flashed across his face. But then the arrogance returned, the sneer that had carried him through every bad decision. "You got the wrong guy," he barked as officers forced him to the floor, cuffing his wrists. "She wasn't even a real woman. You hear me? Not even real." Green crouched beside him, his voice steady, his eyes burning with quiet fury. "She was real enough to fight you, real enough to make you angry, and real enough for you to kill her. Don't you dare say she wasn't real." Derek glared but said nothing more. The fight had drained from him, replaced by the grim acceptance of a man who knew his life was about to be measured in court dates and prison walls. As he was hauled away, Green glanced once more at the photo of Selena tucked into the case file. Her eyes seemed to follow him, luminous even in print. He made another silent promise. "This isn't the end. I'll make sure the world knows who you were, not just how you died." The courthouse was packed from the first day of Derek Johnson's trial. Reporters swarmed the steps outside, cameras flashing as activists held up signs, "Justice for Selena" and "Trans Lives Matter." On the opposite side of the street, a smaller group muttered ugly slurs, their placards scrawled with words meant to erase Selena's very existence. The case had become more than a murder trial. It was a lightning rod for debates about gender, dignity, and violence in America. Detective Harold Green stood quietly at the back of the courtroom as the jury filed in. He had done his part, gathering evidence, piecing together Selena's last moments, tracking down the man who had taken her life. Now it was in the hands of the prosecution. Still, Green felt a heaviness in his chest. He'd seen too many cases where women like Selena were treated as less than human, their killers painted as victims of confusion or provocation. He prayed this wouldn't be one of them. Derek shuffled into the courtroom wearing a wrinkled suit, his wrists shackled until he sat at the defense table. He looked smaller than the man Green had arrested, his bravado dulled by weeks in a cell. Still, his eyes darted around the room, daring anyone to meet his gaze. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Marcia Cole, opened with words that cut through the air like steel. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not complicated. Selena Moore was a woman who had every right to say no. Derek Johnson refused to accept that, and when his pride was wounded, when he could not control her, he killed her. This is not about confusion. This is not about provocation. This is about murder." Derek's defense attorney, a man named Paul Anders, countered with a different narrative. He leaned heavily on prejudice, suggesting Derek had been misled, that Selena's identity was a shock, which triggered a violent reaction. He spoke of heat of passion and temporary loss of control, trying to reduce cold-blooded murder into a momentary lapse. His words drew murmurs of approval from the darker corners of the gallery, but Marcia Cole's eyes never wavered. Witnesses took the stand one by one. The neighbor from 4B recalled hearing Selena scream, her voice desperate, before silence fell. Another described seeing Derek storm from the building in the early morning hours, his face red, his movements erratic. Then came the forensic pathologist, who detailed the bruises on Selena's neck, the defensive wounds on her arms. Her fingernails had broken as she fought for her life, fragments lodged in Derek's skin. The jury shifted uncomfortably as photos of her injuries were displayed on a screen. The evidence spoke of a battle that ended only when her body could no longer fight. But the most powerful testimony came not from experts, but from Selena's friends. One woman, her eyes brimming with tears, described Selena as the bravest person I ever knew. She told the court about Selena's rules, her insistence on consent, her refusal to let anyone buy control over her body. "She said no," the friend whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "And he killed her for it." The courtroom fell silent. When Derek finally took the stand, his arrogance resurfaced. He leaned back in the chair, his voice rising as he tried to justify himself. "She tricked me. She wasn't even a real woman. She thought she could laugh at me, make me look like a fool. I wasn't gonna let that happen." The prosecutor pounced. "So you admit, you weren't defending yourself. You weren't in danger. You killed her because she said no. Isn't that the truth?" Derek hesitated, his jaw clenched, but his silence was louder than any denial. The jury watched him with cold eyes, the image of his pride and violence laid bare. In her closing argument, Marcia Cole spoke directly to the jury. "This case is about dignity. about a woman who lived in truth and a man who couldn't handle it. Selena Moore was not a deception. She was not a trick. She was a person, a daughter, a friend, a woman who deserved to live. And Derek Johnson made sure she didn't, because he thought his ego mattered more than her life. You cannot let that stand. Not here. Not in this city. Not in America. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps filled the courtroom. Selena's friends clutched each other, tears of both grief and relief streaming down their faces. Outside, cheers erupted from the crowd gathered on the steps, their candles and signs raised high. Derek slumped in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. For the first time, the swagger was gone. He was just a man, small and defeated, about to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Judge Watkins spoke firmly, her gavel striking like thunder. Derek Johnson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As deputies led him away, Detective Green let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been served. But as he glanced at Selena's photo in the evidence file one last time, he knew the wound she left behind was deeper than any verdict could heal. Her life had ended in violence, but her story had forced the city, and the courtroom, to confront the ugliness of pride, prejudice, and power. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something bigger than justice. The trial was over, but the echoes of Selena Moore's life and death lingered far beyond the walls of the courthouse. For weeks afterward, her face appeared on posters taped to lampposts, on murals painted by local artists, and on social media feeds filled with both grief and rage. To some, she was just another victim, another file number in the endless churn of violent crime. But to many, she had become a symbol, a woman who dared to live in truth, and who paid the price when pride and prejudice collided in the darkest way. Detective Harold Green walked past the courthouse steps one evening and saw candles still burning where activists had held vigils throughout the trial. The wax dripped in hardened rivers down the stone, a quiet testament to the nights people had gathered to say her name aloud so it would not be forgotten. Selena Moore. The letters looked almost holy in the flicker of candlelight. Green paused, removing his hat as if entering a sanctuary, and bowed his head for a moment of silence. For Green, this case had been unlike any other. He'd investigated dozens of murders, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong, drug deals turned violent, but this one dug under his skin. It wasn't just about evidence or witnesses. It was about how people saw Selena, or rather, how they refused to see her. From the beginning, he had heard the muttered comments. She was asking for it. That kind of life. What do you expect? Those words angered him more than any confrontation in the courtroom. Selena had fought to live on her terms. She wasn't asking to die. She was asking to be respected. And in her final moments, she had refused to surrender. Green couldn't shake that image from his mind, the bruises on her arms, the broken fingernails, proof that she had fought until she had nothing left. It haunted him, but it also strengthened his resolve. If her killer thought he had silenced her, the trial had proved otherwise. Her voice was now louder than ever. Across the city, conversations began to shift. Churches held tense meetings, debating how to speak about gender and identity from the pulpit. Community groups organized panels on violence against transgender women, shining light on statistics too long buried. Politicians were pressured to acknowledge the vulnerability of sex workers, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. For the first time in a long time, people who had ignored these issues were forced to confront them. Selena's death, brutal as it was, had cracked something open. Still, not everyone welcomed that change. Talk radio shows sneered about political correctness, framing Derek as a man who had been deceived. Online comment sections turned vicious, filled with strangers who never knew Selena but felt entitled to strip her of dignity even in death. Green knew this ugliness would never disappear entirely. Prejudice had deep roots. But he also knew something had shifted. Selena's name was now spoken in places where silence once ruled. Her friends carried that torch most fiercely. They organized marches, holding signs with her photo and the words, "She said no." That phrase became a rallying cry, printed on T-shirts, chanted in protests, scrawled on banners. It was more than about Selena. It was about every woman whose refusal had been met with violence. At her memorial service, held in a modest community center decorated with candles and flowers, the room overflowed with people. Some came dressed in sequins and bold colors, honoring the fearless way Selena had presented herself to the world. Others came quietly, holding hands, their grief etched in silence. A gospel choir sang softly, their voices trembling with sorrow and strength. One of Selena's closest friends, a woman named Mariah, stepped to the podium. Her hands shook, but her voice was clear. Selena was more than what the headlines say. She was funny, stubborn, and kind. She taught me how to walk in heels when I could barely stand straight. She listened when I cried. And she believed, truly believed, that no one had the right to take away your choice. She died because she stood by that belief. And if we remember her for nothing else, let us remember her for that. Tears streaked down faces across the room. Green sat in the back, his chest heavy. He wasn't a man given to public emotion, but in that moment he let himself grieve, not just for Selena, but for every life he had seen end too soon. In the months that followed, Derek Johnson faded into the background, swallowed by prison walls and the label of murderer. But Selena's story refused to fade. Documentaries were filmed, articles published, her photo appearing beside statistics about violence against transgender women. Her name became a touchstone in debates about justice and dignity. She had lived in the shadows, but in death she had stepped into the light of history. Green often returned to her file late at night, long after the office had emptied. He'd spread out the photos, the reports, the transcripts, not because he needed to, her case was closed, but because he couldn't let it go. He would stare at her photo, her eyes bold and unflinching, and hear the echo of her final stand. One evening, as rain pattered against his office window, Green spoke aloud though no one was there to hear. "You didn't break, Selena. He killed you, but you didn't break." He realized then that justice wasn't only about verdicts or prison sentences. It was about stories. It was about making sure the world knew who Selena Moore was, not just a victim, not just a headline, but a woman who fought for her right to exist. Her story lived on in the lives she touched, in the movements her death inspired, in the whispered prayers of strangers who lit candles on cold sidewalks. And in the weary heart of a detective who had seen too much darkness, her name remained a small light, flickering, fragile, but unextinguished. Selena Moore had been silenced by violence, but in the silence that followed, her voice grew louder than ever.